take, the initial jolt of fear slowly gave way to a deeper, colder kind of curiosity. It wasn't just that the hands were gone, it was the way they were gone. Not blurred by movement, not hidden by shadows, but simply not there. It was as if the subjects had never possessed them to begin with, or as if some invisible force had carefully erased them before the lens. This wasn't an accident of early photography. This was deliberate. The more I looked, the more unsettling it became. The elegant clothes, the serious faces, the posed stillness, it all felt like a carefully constructed facade, hiding a truth that was profoundly disturbing. I started digging, not just into the history of photography, but into the history of the era itself. The late 1800s were a strange time, a blend of rapid technological advancement and lingering superstition. People were fascinated by the unseen, by spiritualism, by anything that hinted at a world beyond their comprehension. And in small, isolated towns, those beliefs often took on darker forms. I found old newspaper clippings, faded letters, even some local folklore passed down through generations. Nothing directly mentioned missing hands, but there were whispers of a photographer in a remote corner of the country known for his unusual portraits. People spoke of his ability to capture more than just an image, to somehow distill the very essence of a person. But these whispers always ended with a shudder, a quick change of subject, or a warning to never look too closely at his work. This photographer, whose name I eventually pieced together from fragmented records, a Mr. Silas Blackwood, was described as a recluse. He lived on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town called Oakhaven, a place that barely registered on maps even back then. His studio was said to be a converted barn, far from prying eyes. What kind of person would set up shop in such a desolate place and then proceed to create images that were so profoundly unsettling? Was he an artist pushing boundaries, a madman, or something else entirely? The idea of an artist seemed too simple, too clean. There was a macabre precision to the missing hands, a chilling consistency that suggested intent, not just artistic flair. Oakhaven itself began to emerge as a character in this grim story. It wasn't just a quiet rural town. The record spoke of a strange period in its history, roughly around the time the photograph was taken. A series of unexplained disappearances, mostly of young people, but sometimes entire families. The official reports often blamed wanderlust or the lure of the big city, but the local accounts told a different story. They spoke of a shadow that fell over the town, a feeling of dread that settled in the air, especially after dusk. People became withdrawn, suspicious. They closed their curtains earlier, spoke in hushed tones, and avoided certain parts of the woods that bordered Blackwood's property. The disappearances were never officially linked to Blackwood, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. I started to see unsettling parallels. This wasn't just about a strange photographic technique. The late 19th century was also the height of post-mortem photography, where families would pose with their deceased loved ones, often propping them up to appear alive. It was a way to hold on to a memory, to defy death for a moment. But there was also a darker undercurrent to it, a fascination with the boundary between life and death. And then there were the superstitions about cameras stealing souls, about images capturing more than just light. What if Blackwood believed he could capture more than just a likeness? What if he believed he could capture something tangible, something vital? The hands, after all, are instruments of creation, of work, of connection. They reach out, they grasp, they build. To remove them was to remove a fundamental aspect of human interaction and agency. It was to sever a connection, to isolate. The more I delved into Oakhaven's past, the more a disturbing picture began to form. The townspeople, isolated and perhaps a little uneducated, might have been easily swayed by a charismatic, if eccentric, individual. Imagine the power a photographer would have held in an era when cameras were rare and portraits were a luxury. He wasn't just taking pictures, he was creating heirlooms, capturing immortality. And if he demanded something strange, something unsettling, who would dare refuse, especially if there were whispers of his gifts, his ability to truly see people? The idea that he might be doing something else, something ritualistic, began to take root in my mind. The missing hands weren't just a visual trick. They felt like a deliberate act of removal, a sacrifice of some kind. The elegant pose, the pristine setting, the formal attire, it was all a veneer, a thin layer of normalcy over a gaping, unsettling void. The silence in the photograph wasn't just the stillness of a long exposure. It was the silence of something taken, something lost, something deliberately hidden. And Oakhaven, the town itself, seemed to hold its breath, still guarding its secrets, even a century and a half later. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that the photographer at the center of this mystery was a man named Elias Blackwood. His name surfaced repeatedly in the dusty town archives, not as a celebrated artist, but as a peculiar figure, often mentioned with a mix of awe and unease. He arrived in Oakhaven in the late 1860s, a solitary man with a heavy camera and an even heavier silence about his past. Rumors had it he came from a wealthy but estranged family, and that some dark event had driven him to the quiet solitude of Oakhaven. Blackwood's early life, pieced together from fragmented town records and old letters, painted a picture of a child who was always a bit off. He was described as intensely intelligent but socially awkward, preferring the company of books and strange scientific instruments to other children. There were whispers of a childhood accident, a fire perhaps, that left him with a lasting physical scar and, some believed, a deeper, unseen mental one. He was said to have a morbid fascination with anatomy and death, spending hours at the local cemetery, sketching tombstones and, more disturbingly, the decaying flora and fauna he found there. His parents, rigid and unforgiving, saw his interests as an affliction, pushing him further into his own dark world. This early isolation and peculiar focus seemed to have set the stage for the man he would become, a man who saw the world through a different, often unsettling lens. His studio was not in the bustling center of Oakhaven, but on the outskirts, near the edge of the woods that led to the old cemetery. It was a small, unassuming building from the outside, but locals spoke of its interior with hushed voices. It was always dim, even on the sunniest days, lit by a single flickering gas lamp and the faint, diffused light from a high window. The air inside was said to be thick with the smell of chemicals, damp earth, and something else, something indefinable that made people uneasy. Strange artifacts reportedly adorned the walls, dried botanicals, animal skulls, and old leather-bound books filled with cryptic symbols. It wasn't a place of comfort or cheer, but rather a space that felt like a secret, a place where the veil between the ordinary and the strange was thinner. This studio became Blackwood's sanctuary, his laboratory, and eventually the crucible for his unsettling art. Over time, Blackwood's photography evolved from standard portraits to something far more specific and, to many, disturbing. He began to focus on capturing imperfections, not hiding them. A birthmark, a crooked smile, a scar. He would emphasize these details, making them the focal point of his images. People initially found it strange, but Blackwood had a way of convincing them it was true art, a way to capture the authentic self. He spoke of the beauty in flaws, the character etched by life's hardships. But this artistic choice soon morphed into something more overt, more unsettling. He started arranging his subjects in slightly unnatural poses, their faces often serene but their bodies betraying a subtle discomfort, a tension that was almost imperceptible at first glance. He was no longer just capturing imperfections, he was creating them, or at least highlighting them in a way that was almost disfiguring. The genesis of the handless portraits wasn't a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, creeping progression of his artistic obsession. I found an entry in an old, fragmented diary, believed to be Blackwood's, that hinted at his initial thoughts. He wrote about the distraction of the extremities, how hands were too expressive, too full of earthly desires and mundane tasks. He believed they drew attention away from the purity of the soul, which he felt resided in the face and the stillness of the body. He started experimenting, first by having subjects hide their hands behind their backs or under cloaks. Then, he moved to more extreme measures, using clever lighting and long exposures to blur them into invisibility, or positioning objects in front of them. But these were not enough for Blackwood. He wanted a clean slate, a complete removal. He wanted the hands gone, utterly and completely absent, as if they had never been there. It was a deliberate act, a manifestation of his psychological disturbance, a twisted vision of what he considered perfect portraiture. The elegance of the photograph was just a lure, a way to draw the viewer in before revealing the chilling void at its core. He believed he was refining his art, stripping away the unnecessary, but in reality, he was stripping away humanity, one missing hand at a time. The first handless subject to emerge from Blackwood's studio was a young woman named Alara Vance. She was known in town as someone who had always been a little frail, a bit withdrawn. Her family was not wealthy, and the chance for a proper portrait, even a strange one, was likely too good to pass up. The photograph depicted her seated, her face pale and serene, almost doll-like. Her dress was a dark, simple fabric, and she was positioned against a plain, dark backdrop. But where her hands should have rested in her lap, there was nothing, just empty space, as if they had been erased from existence. It wasn't a blur or a shadow or a trick of the light. They were simply gone. The image was unsettling, not overtly horrifying at first glance, but profoundly disturbing once you noticed the void. Alara herself looked almost ethereal, suspended between presence and absence. When Alara's family received the portrait, their reaction was a mixture of confusion and quiet horror. They didn't understand it. They had paid for a full portrait, and here was their daughter, beautiful but incomplete. They initially tried to return it, to complain to Blackwood, but he simply dismissed their concerns. He called it his new vision, a purification of form. He spoke with such conviction, such an air of artistic authority, that the family, already intimidated by his reclusive nature and strange studio, eventually just accepted it. They hung the portrait in a back room, rarely looking at it, but the image and the unsettling feeling it evoked lingered in their minds. It was a quiet controversy, a whisper amongst neighbors who saw the portrait and exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to openly challenge Blackwood, whose reputation as an eccentric was already well established. Blackwood, however, had his own twisted rationale for these removals. I found more fragments of his diary, scribbled notes that became increasingly frantic and less coherent over time. He wrote about hands being connectors to the mundane, vessels of sin, and instruments of earthly corruption. He believed that by removing them, he was elevating his subjects, lifting them above the common fray, making them more spiritual, more pure. He saw hands as distractions from the true essence of a person, which to him was the stillness of their face, the emptiness of their pose. He thought he was purifying his art, stripping away what he perceived as unnecessary physical baggage. He truly believed he was doing something profound, creating a new form of portraiture that transcended the physical. It was a terrifying delusion, born from his growing psychological disturbance. He wasn't just taking photos, he was performing an act of symbolic amputation driven by a deeply disturbed inner world. After Ilara's portrait, more handless images began to appear. First, it was an elderly gentleman, a quiet scholar who had always been particular about his appearance. Then a young couple, their faces unnervingly blank, their clasped hands visibly absent. Each new portrait was more chilling than the last, creating a silent, unsettling pattern. The collection grew, piece by piece, each subject stripped of their hands, each image a testament to Blackwood's unwavering dark vision. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents anymore. It was a series, a growing body of work that defined his studio. People started talking, at first in hushed tones, then with more open apprehension. The initial shock gave way to a creeping dread. The town, which had once tolerated Blackwood's eccentricities, began to feel a growing unease. The handless portraits cast a long, dark shadow over the community. Children, hearing whispers from their parents, would sometimes point at Blackwood's studio as they passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Adults, who once might have considered a portrait with the town's only photographer, now actively avoided his studio. The thought of sitting for him, of having their image captured by the man who made people's hands disappear, became too much to bear. Rumors started to spread like wildfire. Some said Blackwood was a sorcerer, stealing people's hands for dark rituals. Others believed he was simply mad, a dangerous artist whose canvases were people's very likenesses. The local physician, Dr. Albright, a practical man of science, tried to dismiss the fears as superstitions, but even he found himself looking at the portraits with a shiver down his spine. The fear wasn't just about the missing hands. It was about the unknown, the deliberate alteration of reality, the quiet violation of what a portrait should be. People became hesitant to even interact with Blackwood on the street, crossing to the other side when they saw him approaching. His reclusive nature, once seen as quirky, now seemed sinister. The town was slowly becoming consumed by a collective dread, a silent acknowledgement that something was deeply, terribly wrong. The elegance of the photographs no longer charmed. It only highlighted the terrifying absence that lay at their core. The portraits were no longer just pictures. They were symbols of a creeping horror that had settled over the quiet community, slowly tightening its grip. The handless portraits were more than just an artistic quirk. They were becoming something far more ritualistic, something sinister that seeped into the very fabric of the town. Blackwood wasn't just erasing hands from images. He was, in a twisted way, erasing a fundamental part of human identity. Hands, after all, are central to almost everything we do. They are how we create, how we connect, how we defend ourselves, how we express affection. They're tools for work, instruments for art, and symbols of power and agency. To remove them was to strip away a person's ability to interact with the world, to leave them symbolically helpless and incomplete. This wasn't merely a stylistic choice. It was an act of profound dehumanization, a ritual designed to diminish and control. Blackwood's process was shrouded in secrecy, but whispers began to circulate about what happened inside his studio. No one knew exactly how he achieved the effect. Some said he used special chemicals that somehow blurred the hands into nothingness. Others, with wider eyes, spoke of dark magic, of incantations whispered over the photographic plates. There were even a few who suggested he physically restrained his subjects' hands, hiding them behind their backs or under their clothes, then manipulated the images in some way. But the precision of the absence, the clean, almost surgical void where hands should have been, made these explanations feel insufficient. It felt deliberate, controlled, almost methodical. The prevailing theory, fueled by fear, was that he was doing something truly unnatural, something that defied logical explanation. His studio became a place of dread, a forbidden zone where people's physical forms were distorted in ways no one could comprehend. It was baffling why people continued to pose for him, even as the unsettling nature of his work became clear. Some were simply ignorant, newcomers to town who hadn't yet heard the rumors, or desperate individuals who saw Blackwood as the only photographer available. Others perhaps were driven by a strange form of societal pressure. In an era when photography was still a luxury, a portrait was a mark of status, a way to leave a legacy. Maybe they feared being left out, or perhaps they felt a strange obligation to participate in the town's peculiar, silent ritual. There was also the terrifying possibility that some were simply too afraid to refuse him. Blackwood, despite his reclusiveness, had a certain intimidating presence. His intense gaze, his quiet demeanor, and the growing reputation of his macabre art might have instilled a fear that made refusal seem impossible. People might have felt trapped, caught between the desire for a portrait and the unsettling cost of obtaining it. As the collection grew, a chilling pattern emerged. It wasn't just about the absence of hands. It was about the subtle glint in Blackwood's eyes when he looked at the finished pieces. It was a look of satisfaction, of accomplishment, as if he had achieved something profound and terrible. This wasn't just about aesthetics for him. The removal of hands seemed to be a means to an end, a step in a larger, darker ambition. The townspeople couldn't articulate it, but they felt it, a sense that the photographer was not merely removing hands, but transferring them or their essence to some unseen entity or purpose. It was a terrifying thought that parts of them, their very ability to act and create, were being siphoned off, harvested for some unknown, malevolent design. The handless portraits became a window into something unseen, a glimpse behind a veil that most people preferred to keep closed. They hinted at a world where boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were blurred, where images held a power far beyond mere representation. Each portrait, with its elegant facade and its disturbing void, was a silent scream, a testament to a ritual that was slowly consuming the town. The subjects, frozen in time without their hands, seemed to be offering up a part of themselves, willingly or unwillingly, to Blackwood's dark vision. The act of sitting for him was no longer just posing for a picture, it was participation in a ritual, a silent sacrifice of agency. The town found itself caught in a strange, unspoken pact, haunted by the images that reflected their own growing fear and helplessness. The elegance of the 1879 photograph, once a source of admiration, was now a chilling reminder of the ritual that had taken hold, a silent monument to the enduring mystery of the vanishing hands. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken questions, with the weight of something ancient and terrible stirring beneath the surface of their quiet lives. The unspoken pact, the chilling elegance, and the pervasive sense of dread finally drew the attention of someone from beyond the town's stifling silence. His name was Arthur Penhaligon, a quiet but sharp-witted journalist from a city newspaper known for its investigative pieces. Arthur wasn't looking for ghosts or dark rituals when he first heard whispers of the handless portraits from a merchant passing through. He was looking for a good story, something unusual that would capture his readers' imaginations. The merchant had spoken of the town with a shudder, describing the strange photographs and the even stranger photographer, Blackwood, who created them. Intrigued, Arthur packed his bags and made the journey, expecting to find a peculiar artist, perhaps a charlatan, but certainly not the deep, unsettling mystery that awaited him. Upon his arrival, the town felt different, heavier than any place he had visited before. The people were wary, their eyes darting away when he asked about Blackwood. He quickly realized that the merchant's description had only scratched the surface of the town's unease. He started by examining the few handless portraits he could find, mostly in the homes of those too proud or too stubborn to hide them away. Each one confirmed the merchant's tale. Subjects posed elegantly, their faces serene, but their hands were simply gone, as if they had never existed. It wasn't poor photography or damage, it was a deliberate, unsettling absence. Arthur began to connect the dots, a task made difficult by the townspeople's reluctance to speak. He noticed that many of the handless subjects shared a common thread, though it was subtle at first. They weren't all from the same family or social circle, but there was a pattern in their vulnerability. Some were recent widows, others were children from large, struggling families, and a few were older individuals living alone. It seemed Blackwood preyed on those who might be less likely to have powerful advocates, or whose disappearance might go unnoticed for a time. He also learned of a strange, shared affliction that had swept through the town years prior, a kind of wasting sickness that left people weak and listless, though no doctor had ever properly diagnosed it. Could there be a connection? His breakthrough came when he befriended an elderly woman, Mrs. Albright, who had once worked as a cleaner for Blackwood. She was terrified to speak, but after weeks of Arthur's patient, gentle inquiries, she finally relented, her voice barely a whisper. She told him about the photographer's studio, a place she described as cold and filled with a strange, metallic smell. More importantly, she spoke of a hidden room, a small, windowless space that Blackwood always kept locked. She had only seen inside once when he was away, and described it as filled with strange instruments, vials of dark liquids, and a large leather-bound book that looked like a journal. She hadn't dared to touch it, but the memory of its presence had haunted her. This led Arthur to the town's dusty archives, where he painstakingly researched Blackwood's past. He found old property deeds, birth records, and even a few newspaper clippings from years ago. He discovered that Blackwood had arrived in town about 15 years prior, a quiet man with no family, who quickly set up his photography studio. There was a brief mention of a dispute with a local doctor who had accused Blackwood of unorthodox practices, though the details were vague and the accusation had seemingly been dismissed. The most chilling discovery was a series of small, almost hidden obituaries. He cross-referenced these with the handless portraits he had seen. The pattern was undeniable. Several of the handless subjects had also mysteriously disappeared within months of having their portraits taken, or their deaths had been attributed to sudden, unusual circumstances, a fever, a fall, a wasting illness that seemed to mirror the affliction Mrs. Albright had described. The town had simply accepted these explanations, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of a desperate need for normalcy. The town's conspiracy of silence became clearer the deeper Arthur dug. When he asked direct questions, people would simply look away, mumble excuses, or pretend not to understand. The local constable, a portly man named Miller, was particularly unhelpful, always suggesting that Arthur was imagining things or stirring up trouble. It wasn't outright hostility, but a deep ingrained fear that had settled over the community like a fog. They were either complicit in the secret through their silence and fear, or too terrified to speak out against Blackwood, whose influence seemed to stretch far beyond his studio. Arthur realized that the town wasn't just tolerating Blackwood, it was protecting him, willingly or unwillingly. The idea that a whole community could be so deeply entangled in such a dark secret was almost as horrifying as the secret itself. He knew he was close to something terrible, something that would shake the foundations of this quiet, isolated place. The journalist felt a growing urgency. He had to find that journal. He had to uncover what Blackwood was truly doing with those missing hands. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths and the chilling presence of a darkness that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Arthur knew he couldn't wait any longer. The evidence he'd pieced together, from Mrs. Albright's hushed confession to the chilling pattern in the obituaries, painted a picture too grim to ignore. He had to confront Blackwood. The journalist decided to act under the cover of night, hoping to catch the photographer off guard, and more importantly, to get into that locked room and find the journal. He knew it was risky, bordering on illegal, but the official channels were clearly useless, choked by the town's fear. He waited until the town was truly asleep, the moon a sliver in the dark sky. The silence was heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Arthur moved like a shadow, making his way to Blackwood's studio. The building stood alone at the edge of town, a dark, imposing structure that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. He remembered Mrs. Albright's description of the cold, metallic smell and felt a shiver run down his spine. He found a back window, old and slightly rotted, and with a bit of effort managed to pry it open. The creak was loud in the stillness, making him freeze, listening for any sign of movement inside. Nothing. He slipped inside, the air immediately colder than outside, carrying a faint, unsettling scent, not quite metallic, more like old chemicals mixed with something organic and unpleasant. His heart hammered against his ribs. He moved cautiously through the main studio, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Shapes of equipment, backdrops, and props loomed like silent sentinels. He found the door Mrs. Albright had described, heavy and solid, clearly designed to keep things in or out. It was locked, as expected. Arthur had come prepared. He pulled out a set of lock-picking tools he'd acquired during his less-than-ethical investigative days. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he worked. The clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room. Finally, with a soft thud, the lock gave way. He pushed the door open slowly, a narrow beam of moonlight from the window, illuminating a sliver of the room. The air inside was stagnant, even colder than the studio, and the unsettling smell was much stronger here. He fumbled for his small lantern and lit it. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that made his blood run cold. The room was small, as Mrs. Albright had said, but it was far more disturbing than he could have imagined. On a central table, under a thick layer of dust, lay an array of instruments, not photography equipment, but surgical tools, scalpels, clamps, and what looked like bone saws, all meticulously cleaned and arranged. Vials of dark liquids, some labeled with faded Latin script, lined shelves, and there it was, on a small, cluttered desk in the corner, the leather-bound journal. Arthur's hands shook as he reached for it. He opened the journal. Blackwood's handwriting was precise, almost elegant, but the words were anything but. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, but a horrifying record of his experiments. He wrote about the imperfection of the human form, the distraction of the appendages, and his belief that hands were conduits for earthly desires that corrupted the pure essence of a person. He believed that by removing them, he could capture a subject's true, unblemished soul in his photographs. The journal detailed his process, not just the physical removal, but a ritual he performed involving strange incantations and the dark liquids in the vials. He wrote about the transfer of the hand's essence, their vitality, to something he referred to only as the vessel. He did not explicitly state what the vessel was, but his descriptions hinted at it being something that consumed and grew stronger with each transfer. He celebrated each successful purification, noting the subject's subsequent serenity in the portraits, a serenity Arthur now recognized as a chilling emptiness. Then came the horrific revelation, the fate of the missing hands. Blackwood didn't destroy them, he preserved them. In a hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the wall, Arthur found a series of small, meticulously crafted wooden boxes. Each box contained a pair of mummified hands, shriveled and dark, perfectly preserved. They were labeled with names and dates, corresponding to the subjects in the handless portraits he had seen. The sheer number of them, the cold, clinical way they were stored, made Arthur gag. Blackwood wasn't just taking pictures, he was collecting trophies, parts of people, believing he was perfecting them, purifying them. As Arthur stood there, reeling from the ghastly discovery, a voice cut through the silence, cold and calm. "Looking for something, Mr. Davies?" Blackwood stood in the doorway, a tall, gaunt figure, silhouetted against the faint light from the studio. He held a heavy, ornate camera tripod like a club. His eyes, usually hidden behind his spectacles, were wide and gleaming with a terrifying intensity. Arthur froze, the journal still clutched in his hand. The photographer's face, usually so composed, was now a mask of chilling fury. Blackwood stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the journal. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have meddled." His voice was low, almost a hiss. "You don't understand the purity I seek, the beauty I create." He gestured around the room with the tripod, encompassing the surgical tools, the vials, the hidden compartment of hands. They were corrupted, all of them. Their hands, grasping, desiring, defiling. I freed them. I gave them peace. Arthur swallowed, his mouth dry. "You murdered them, Blackwood. You mutilated them." The photographer chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Murder? No, Mr. Davies. I liberated them. And now, you see too much. You threaten my work, my art. And for that, you must also be purified." He raised the tripod, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying, unhinged conviction. Arthur knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was looking at a madman, a monster who truly believed his grotesque acts were a form of salvation. The town's silence, its fear, had allowed this depravity to fester, to grow into something unspeakable. Now Arthur was face to face with its horrifying culmination. The confrontation he had sought was upon him, and the chilling truth was far more gruesome than he had ever imagined. Arthur ducked, just as the heavy tripod swung through the air, missing his head by inches. The metallic clang against the brick wall echoed loudly in the small, dusty room. Blackwood, surprisingly agile for his gaunt frame, spun around, his eyes still burning with that manic light. Arthur scrambled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard. His mind raced, trying to find an escape, a weapon, anything. The photographer advanced, his breathing heavy, a strange mix of exhilaration and rage contorting his features. He truly believed he was doing something righteous. "You will understand, Mr. Davies," Blackwood panted, raising the tripod again. "You will become part of the greater purity." Arthur rolled to his feet, grabbing a heavy, ornate wooden frame from a nearby table. It was one of Blackwood's finished pieces, perhaps depicting a family with their unsettling, empty wrists. He swung it wildly, hoping to create some distance. The frame connected with Blackwood's arm, eliciting a grunt of pain but not stopping him. The tripod came down again, this time glancing off Arthur's shoulder. A sharp pain shot through him, but adrenaline dulled the worst of it. He needed to get out, and more importantly, he needed to expose what was happening here. He feigned a lunge to the left, then darted right, making a beeline for the studio's heavy wooden door. Blackwood roared, a guttural sound that sent shivers down Arthur's spine, and pursued him. Just as Arthur reached the door, fumbling with the stiff latch, Blackwood tackled him from behind. They crashed to the floor, dust and old chemicals filling the air. The tripod clattered away, sliding under a workbench. Blackwood's hands, surprisingly strong, wrapped around Arthur's throat. Arthur struggled, clawing at the photographer's fingers. Blackwood's face was inches from his, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes wild and unblinking. "The hands, they are the conduits of sin. I sever the connection," he hissed, his voice strained. Arthur felt his vision blurring, the air leaving his lungs. He thrashed, desperate, and his hand closed around something cold and sharp on the floor. One of Blackwood's scalpels likely dropped during the struggle. With a surge of desperate strength, he brought it up, plunging it blindly. Blackwood gasped, his grip loosening. He recoiled, clutching his side. Arthur scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, his throat raw. Blackwood stumbled backward, his manic energy draining from him, replaced by shock and pain. He looked down at the dark stain blooming on his waistcoat, then up at Arthur, his eyes wide, no longer filled with madness, but with a dawning realization of his own mortality. He swayed, then collapsed against a stack of dusty photographic plates, sending them crashing to the floor in a cacophony of shattering glass. Arthur didn't wait. He burst out of the studio, gasping, disoriented, into the dim alleyway behind the building. He ran, not stopping until he reached the town's main street, where the gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows. He found the local constable, a burly man named O'Malley, enjoying a quiet evening at the tavern. Arthur, still disheveled and shaken, recounted the horrors he had found, showing O'Malley the journal he still clutched. O'Malley, initially skeptical, was convinced by Arthur's genuine terror and the detailed entries in the journal. They returned to the studio with a small contingent of townsfolk, their faces grim. They found Blackwood, still alive but fading, clutching his wound. The hidden compartment, with its ghastly collection of mummified hands, was discovered, sealing Blackwood's fate. He was arrested, his ramblings about purification and vessels chilling the constable and those who heard them. The trial was a sensation, drawing reporters from the city. Blackwood, still unrepentant, declared his actions were for the good of humanity, a twisted artistic endeavor. He was deemed insane and committed to an asylum, where he reportedly continued to sketch hands endlessly on the walls of his cell. The legacy of the handless portraits, however, lived on. The studio was immediately shut down, its contents seized. The photographs themselves became objects of morbid fascination. Some were destroyed by horrified families, desperate to erase the memory. Others, like the one Arthur had first seen, were preserved, not as art, but as chilling artifacts, warnings of the darkness that could fester beneath a veneer of respectability. They were studied by scholars, displayed in hushed exhibits, a testament to a unique and disturbing chapter in photographic history. The town, for its part, never fully recovered. Its reputation was forever tainted, whispered about as the town of the handless. The initial shock gave way to a deep, pervasive shame. People avoided speaking of Blackwood or of the families whose loved ones had become his unwitting subjects. A silent conspiracy of discomfort settled over the community. Some families moved away, unable to bear the scrutiny and the haunting memories. Others stayed, forever marked by the events, their once proud lineage now associated with a grotesque secret. Even with Blackwood locked away, a sense of lingering mystery persisted. What was the vessel he spoke of? Was it merely a delusion? Or did he truly believe he was transferring something tangible? The journal hinted at a deeper, almost mystical element to his madness, something beyond simple mutilation. The precise ritual, the dark liquids, the essence transfer, these details remained unexplained, adding a layer of unsettling, almost supernatural horror to an already disturbing story. No one could fully comprehend the depths of his twisted beliefs, leaving a permanent shadow over the horrific truth. Years later, Arthur Davies, now a respected journalist, would often revisit the photograph that started it all. The elegant portrait, with its unnerving empty wrists, still held a strange power over him. It was a permanent, unsettling reminder that beneath seemingly beautiful and ordinary surfaces, darkness could lurk, unseen and unimagined, waiting for someone to finally notice what was missing. The image served as a constant echo of the horrors he had uncovered, a silent scream from the past, forever etched in time.